There is a major difference between being mature and being adult. Any random piece of media can throw in crude, crass, and other lowbrow topics and qualify as adult, but that doesn't make it mature. Conversely, a piece of media for children can tackle extremely serious topics like war without ever using a curse word. It's not adult, but it is mature. Finding the difference between these concepts is very important, whether you're writing a book, movie, show, or video game. If you try to make your story adult by including topics like religion, war, and societal issues, but fail to give them the nuance they deserve, you run the risk of ending up with the worst fate imaginable: making something cringe. Hello, my name is Jaru. This video will be covering a lot of topics. It's partially a review of the demo for the indie RPG beloved Rapture. However, a random review of an indie game you've never heard of would be boring, so I'm expanding this video to be something you'll find interesting even if you're not interested in this game. Namely, I will be discussing the pitfalls and traps that writers can stumble into when trying to make their games seem more quote-unquote mature. I'll also be discussing some other stuff as well. If you enjoy the video, consider supporting me on Patreon. Have you ever watched a cartoon labeled as adult animation that acts like it's so cool for making sex jokes and swearing a lot, but it ultimately just comes across as juvenile and unpleasant? Have you ever watched a movie that has taken a piece of children's media and made it gritty so that it appeals to adults, only for it to end up being an embarrassment to the source material? Have you ever played a horror game where the developers clearly think they're so clever for having the villain be evil because of some psychological disorder when it's really just them ignorantly vilifying the mentally ill? If you said yes to any of these, then you have encountered a piece of media that has tried and failed to be mature. But why? Why are so many writers so desperate to inject adult content into all these different stories? Well, the reality is that all writers, at one point or another, see a show or movie or game and think, dang, I really liked this, but I wish they had done X better. This can manifest in a number of different ways. Maybe there's a theme that you wish had been further explored, or maybe there's a character who you wish had been better fleshed out, or maybe there's a relationship that you wish had been written more naturally. This desire to see a story you like done better is a driving motivator for many writers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Brandon Sanderson is one of the best fantasy writers of our time, and a big part of his success comes from him taking classic fantasy tropes and simply exploring them with more believable characters and more natural dialogue. He took what he enjoyed and improved upon it. Now, a lot of the time, these writers are not specifically thinking, I want a more adult version of this. Rather, they just want to see a better version. However, what writers imagine as better often consists of including more mature themes, writing, and characters. So while they may not have set out to make adult content, that is where they ultimately end up. And that's not inherently a bad thing. Adult content, like any type of content, can be very engaging, but it has to be handled well. So, what's the difference between good adult content and bad adult content? Well, to put it simply, it's competent writing. That seems obvious, just write better, Lamau. But when it comes to tackling mature themes and concepts, it's not as clear what are the correct and incorrect methods for depicting these topics. So let's look at an example and see how video game developers have succeeded and failed to tackle adult content. When discussing the idea of adult themes and concepts in video games, it's hard to get more adult than Silent Hill. From its horrific imagery and demonic monstrosities to its psychotic citizens and mentally disturbed protagonists, this is absolutely adult content, and people loved it. Silent Hill was so popular that it would go on to inspire thousands of indie developers to take their shot at making their very own Silent Hill. However, most of these indie games were absolute trash. Aside from just having way less budget, these indie devs also just didn't understand the difference between writing an adult story and writing a mature story. For example, if you've heard anything about this franchise, you'll know that Silent Hill is somewhat incorrectly associated with a particular brand of plot twist, namely the protagonist was crazy all along twist. As a result, tons of Silent Hill inspired indie games end up having an entire story end with none of it actually happened, the protagonist was just crazy and killed their family or something to that effect. This is such a grotesque oversimplification of what made the Silent Hill protagonists work, it's ridiculous. The thing that made Silent Hill protagonists interesting was the fact that, yes, they were often suffering from mental health issues of various types, but it's never as simple as they were crazy and this made them do bad things. More often than not, these protagonists were completely normal people who were forced into terrible situations where they were then obligated to make morally gray choices. These choices then go on to torment and traumatize them until they're forced to confront their past in the supernatural town of Silent Hill, a place that manifests your inner demons as literal monsters. When James fights Pyramid Head, he's not just a generic hero fighting a generic monster. He's a very disturbed man forced to confront a demon that embodies the guilt he feels for his past actions. When James overcomes Pyramid Head, it's meaningful because he's not just banishing a demon, he's literally overcoming his past trauma in order to allow himself to finally heal and move on. This is very thematically rich and mature storytelling, and it treats mental illness as a nuanced and complex issue that plagues completely decent people. James is a victim, not a monster. This nuance, this subtlety, is something that the indie games inspired by Silent Hill often lack. They just have their protagonists and antagonists be crazy and evil with no real depth or realism. They're still tackling the same adult themes as Silent Hill, but due to their poor writing skills, they end up childishly oversimplifying these concepts to the point that it loses all meaning and only serves to dehumanize the mentally ill. It's adult, but not mature. I could list more examples of media that tries and fails to tackle adult themes, but we've still got a lot more to talk about, and I think you get the point. The line between mature and adult is a fine one, and the ability of your writers will decide which side of this line you'll end up on. Introducing adult topics into your story can go really well or really badly, and the competency of your writing will either make it nuanced or juvenile. And this brings us to Beloved Rapture. Beloved Rapture is an indie RPG published by Two Left Thumbs and developed by Aaron Crawford. It's heavily inspired by classic JRPGs, and it strives to tell a fun fantasy story while also tackling some rather adult subject material. The story of Beloved Rapture is split up into chapters, and the first chapter, as well as the beginning of the second chapter, are currently available as a free demo on Steam. When I first played the demo, I really had no idea what I was getting into, and I was pleasantly surprised at how much fun I had with it. But when I got to the very end of the demo, I began to manifest some concerns regarding where exactly this game falls on the mature versus adult spectrum. These concerns manifested because after experiencing this first chapter, I am convinced that Beloved Rapture has the potential to not only be a great game, but also an important one. But I'm getting ahead of myself. In order to understand just how much is riding on this story being well made, you have to understand just how good the rest of the experience is. And if you're getting impatient, rest assured, I'll be explaining this thumbnail very soon. The visuals in Beloved Rapture utilize a fairly typical sprite-based style, but it's a far cry from the oversimplified environments of early JRPGs. The world is absolutely teeming with life, with countless animals wandering the environment and making the world feel legitimately lived in. The plants flutter in the breeze, the water ripples serenely, and a faint mist floats across the ground. The weather effects are also very immersive, and that's not even to speak of the gorgeous background art that appears every time you reach the top of a building or the edge of a cliff. The sprite art used in the menus is delightfully detailed, and the animations in combat are perfectly satisfying. The early game spells and attacks are fairly simple, but that doesn't stop them from being fun to see in action. Furthermore, when talking to important characters, these high-resolution portraits appear to showcase the characters' emotions and reactions in more clear detail than what regular sprites can portray. The anime art style may not be everyone's cup of tea, but if you like JRPGs, and Persona's sales figures tell me that you do, then you'll probably love it. Then there's the music, and let me just say, composer Andreas does a fantastic job making this soundtrack feel appropriate for the genre while also still being pleasant to listen to and stylistically unique. From the exciting combat music, to the sleepy comfort of the village theme. To my personal favorite, the title theme, which goes way harder than it needs to. My man Andreas was just flexing with this one. But what has to be my absolute favorite part of this demo was the combat, which was surprisingly engaging. Normally, turn-based RPGs are rather repetitive and dull in terms of gameplay. As someone who played through both Final Fantasy 1 and 2, I can confirm that it basically boils down to brainless spamming. But beloved Rapture makes some tweaks that already make this game's combat far more engaging. For one, the combat is only partially turn-based. Similar to something like Final Fantasy VII, each character has a timer that has to fill up before you can take an action. Once it's filled, you can take your turn, but the enemy also has such a timer, and their timer continues to fill up even while you're moving through your menus to select your next action. This means that players are rewarded for making quick decisions in the heat of combat by getting to take multiple actions before the enemy can retaliate, but only if you're quick enough. If that sounds intimidating, don't worry. It's still partially turn-based, so if you sit there and do nothing, the enemy will also pause their attacks while they wait for you to go. To put it another way, imagine there's two cowboys about to draw their guns and fire. If you're quick enough in giving your command, you'll fire first. But if you do nothing and let the enemy attack, they'll fire first. However, after firing, the enemy will not reload their gun until after you have taken your turn. You are rewarded for quick reactions, but the system allows you to take things slowly if you prefer. I personally think this is a really clever compromise between real-time combat and turn-based combat, as it allows for the slow pace that fans of turn-based combat enjoy, but for those who find that too slow and boring, it rewards them for making quick decisions and keeping up a fast pace in battle. Of course, this reward is only meaningful if you can make strategic decisions and not just spam attacks. So let's look at what you can actually do during combat. First is the basic basic attack, which works more or less how you'd expect. When you launch an attack, you do some damage and restore a small amount of MP. But you also gain a stack of Relica, which is effectively a streamlined version of a limit break. But unlike the limit breaks of Final Fantasy, Relica is much more consistent and easier to strategize around. Every time you launch a basic attack, you get 1 stack of Relica, and when you get 3 stacks, you can use your next turn to launch a powerful super attack. These super attacks are generally heavy-hitting special techniques with pretty cool animations. I really like the Relica system, as it allows you to actually strategize around your limit breaks instead of just sorta hoping they'll be available when you need them. That said, there is one drawback to using Relicas. They cost a huge chunk of your MP. So, if you choose to use a Relica, you'll be sacrificing your ability to use your magic for other things until it recharges, such as your spells. Spells in this game are your fairly standard RPG affair. There's lightning, ice, fire, and so on. These spells generally do more damage than your basic attacks, but less damage than Relica. However, there's also the added caveat of spells having elemental damage assigned to them, which means that certain enemies will take reduced damage or bonus damage depending on what kind of spell you use. So do you focus on using basic attacks and building up towards an expensive but powerful Relica? Or do you focus on using spells to try and exploit enemy weaknesses? You can just spam regular attacks, but that's not always the most effective option, especially since spells have a chance of inflicting status effects like getting frozen, burned, or poisoned. As cool as Relica is, my favorite mechanic has to be the defend mechanic. When you use defend, you reduce all incoming damage for a short time, which seems pretty basic. However, defending also heals you for a solid amount, and this is significant because there is no healing magic at the start of the game, and healing items are limited. This means that in combat, using defend will be your primary method for keeping your health high. But here's the catch: the defend heal can't be used multiple times in a row. You can reduce the incoming damage back to back, but the healing property won't proc again until you do something other than defend. For example, if you defend twice in a row, you'll only be healed on the first usage, but if you defend, attack, and then defend again, you'll be healed on both instances. This mechanic, even though it seems rather simple, completely changes the flow of combat. You can't just spam attacks and hope for the best. You actually need to utilize all the tools in your arsenal. In order to optimize your turns, you need to be mixing in defends with your other actions. Otherwise, you'll run out of health rather quickly. And you can't just wait until you're low health to heal, because you can't heal back to back. So this system encourages you to mix up your gameplay right from the start of the fight. By getting into a flow of attacking, casting spells, using Relica, and defending, you can optimize your potential. And you really need to optimize in this game, because Beloved Rapture is far from easy. There is a story mode option, which is basically an easy mode, but if you're on the classic mode, then you better be prepared for a challenge. There are no random encounters in this game, unlike most classic RPGs, but there are required scripted encounters that you have to complete in order to progress. Thanks to there being fewer required fights due to there being no random encounters, this allows Crawford and crew to prioritize quality over quantity, with each fight giving a solid challenge. These challenges are never so hard that it's impossible, but it's also never so easy that you can turn off your brain. It's a very engaging experience, and so long as Rapture continues to expand upon the groundwork laid during this demo, the combat system has the potential to be one of my favorites of all time. So, as you can see, Beloved Rapture seems to do everything right. The visuals are great, the music is great, and the gameplay is great. There are a few bugs in the demo, mostly graphical glitches, but they're very minor and will be fixed by the time of the full release. So, as it stands, I have no real complaints. However, you may have noticed there's one element of this game I've glossed over: the story. How good is the plot of this game? Well, the basic premise is as follows. Our protagonist, Johann, has just turned 18, and he's beginning to contemplate his future. He's always lived in his sleepy village, but he dreams of something more. He's then gifted a magical sword with a mythic origin, at which point everything seems to rapidly change. His village is attacked by an evil cult, and they're led by Johann's estranged father. They escape before Johann can have a decisive battle with them, so now he must set out on a quest to avenge his hometown, assemble a misfit group of heroes, and save the world from Armageddon. Now, if that whole setup sounds familiar, that's because it's more or less the same intro to just about every fantasy story ever written. Lord of the Rings, Aragon, and a fair number of RPGs start very similarly, and Beloved Rapture plays the tropes fairly straight. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. This sort of intro is popular for a reason. It does a good job of establishing the story, motivations, and key plot devices. Keep in mind, it's totally fine to reuse popular tropes so long as you add your own creative spin to them. And does Beloved Rapture bring something unique to the table? Absolutely. Aside from the baseline plot, this chapter also introduces a major religion, political turmoil in the local empire, the concept of nature spirits who channel their power through magical weapons like Johann's sword, which is called Amaterasu, by the way, and it introduces the idea of this magical, spiritual substance that people can attune to, and which seemingly grows on trees. That's a lot of world building, which is far from generic. At this point, though, you're probably wondering, what's the problem? If the story is solid and the visuals, gameplay, and music are all great, then why am I talking like I'm about to reveal some major downside? When am I going to explain this wacky thumbnail? Well, the thing is, while there's no major downside to this game thus far, there was one thing that raised some concerns. You see, the vast majority of this demo is very firmly in the PG range. There's some combat against monsters, sure, but it's not graphic at all, and there's never any cursing, sexual innuendos, or any other adult content. Or rather, there's none of that until the end. In the last few minutes of the demo, there is a pretty jarring tone shift that occurs. When Johann's village is attacked, we find the bloody corpses of the town people strewn about. Characters start dropping the F-bomb repeatedly, and the villain even makes creepy sexual comments towards Johann's mother. This all comes completely out of left field and was more than a little shocking when I first experienced it. Now, to be clear, none of the things I just described are inherently a bad thing. Blood, cursing, and suggestive content are all things you can find in RPGs, with Final Fantasy VII, one of the most popular RPGs of all time, having all three of these. And it's not like Crawford threw these things in without a purpose. The blood helps sell the horror of this situation. The cursing helps ground the characters in realism. As you can bet, I'd be swearing if I saw this stuff. And sexual suggestion from the villain helps sell just how far he has fallen psychologically, and realistically, it's no more absurd than something like Don Corneo in FF7. All of these things can be explained and justified for their inclusion, and it may even elevate the experience in the eyes of some. So why does this worry me? Well, it all ties back to the main idea I presented earlier: mature versus adult. Including this sort of content means the developers of Beloved Rapture have taken a firm step into the realm of adult media, and that means they have two paths ahead of them. If they handle this adult content carefully and with nuance, then they could elevate their game to a whole new level of quality. But if they fail to handle it maturely, they'll end up going down the path of shock value and cringe. The reason I'm worried is because, as it stands, I have no idea which path they're going to take. If this entire demo had been nothing but blood, sex, and cursing, then I know it was going to be bad. but because it avoided using these things until the very end, it leaves me uncertain of how the rest of the game is going to play out. Is this a sign that the game is going to be nothing but adult content from now on, thrown in non-stop for shock value? Or is it a sign that the developers understand restraint and are willing to only use adult content when it best serves the story? I've seen games walk down both of these paths before, with some ending up as non-stop cringe and others very cleverly using their adult themes. However, here's the real issue. If this game was just some run-of-the-mill indie RPG, then I wouldn't be that invested in its success. Sure, I'd like to see it succeed because I generally like seeing indie devs prosper, but it wouldn't be any skin off my back if it failed. This wouldn't be the first time an indie game failed to live up to its potential, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. However, Beloved Rapture isn't just trying to be a run-of-the-mill RPG. It has much loftier goals in mind, which is where my real concerns lie. And it's here where this thumbnail finally comes into play. I promised you LGBT and religion, and now you're going to get it. The religion angle is pretty self-evident. The game is called Beloved Rapture. The villains are all members of a cult. There is a prominent goddess with at least one of the main characters having a negative attitude towards her, and the other protagonist spends a lot of the first chapter questioning the existence of things like spirits, monsters, and so on. It is extremely clear that Crawford and crew have something they want to say about religion in this game, and given how everyone in Johan's life ends up lying to him in this demo, it's possible they'll be tackling the theme of faith in general. Not just faith in religion, but faith in people as well. Already, this is some really heavy stuff to be tackling in your fantasy RPG. But that's not all. You see, something I've neglected to mention thus far is the fact that on the Steam page for Beloved Rapture, they specifically mentioned their intention to include LGBT themes in this game, with them specifically noting that Johan confronting his sexuality is going to be a key part of his story. This is where Beloved Rapture steps out of the realm of fun indie games and into the realm of something more serious. To be perfectly transparent, I'm not a member of the LGBT, but I do have a brain, and I can recognize significant historical trends when I see them. The struggle for LGBT acceptance in society has been a slow and painful path, but in the last few decades, there has been a shocking amount of development. And while you can see the evidence of this in many places, one of the most obvious is in our media. The portrayal of the LGBT in media, be it shows, movies, books, or games, has evolved over time, and it's worthwhile to take note of the milestones that have been achieved on this front. It's also important to understand this history in order to recognize the role Beloved Rapture plays in it. At the start of the 20th century, homosexuals were rarely featured in film, and when they were featured, they were exclusively depicted as forces of evil and degeneracy. They were viewed as unnatural perversions who threatened our society, and thus that was the only way they were allowed to be portrayed. Overly Sarcastic Productions has a great video on the history of this if you'd like to learn more. Long story short, as time passed and society became less Puritan in its values, we shifted away from regarding the LGBT as being something to hate and more so as something to mock. They were no longer villains or threats to our society, they were now clowns and freaks to be laughed at. There's a reason bearded ladies were such a common trope to associate with circuses. This shift from hatred to mockery was technically progress, although it may not feel like it. However, everything changed as we reached the end of the 20th century, and the civil rights movement swung into full force. It is here where we see the first meaningful shift to occur in my lifetime: the depiction of homosexuals as being occasionally just as moral as everyone else. This attitude shift was subtle, and it was extremely rare for there to be prominent main characters who were gay, but we started to see one-off gay characters in popular mainstream shows. They would often still be the target of many jokes, yes, but the heterosexual main cast would often end up learning a lesson from said gay person, or at the very least, they would be shown to be no more unethical than the rest of the characters. It became common for every mainstream show to have at least one LGBT-oriented episode, and while the quality of this representation varied, the fact that this was happening at all was unprecedented. However, moving into the 21st century, it was clear that there was still a ton of work to be done. Attitudes were shifting, but gay marriage was still illegal in large portions of the United States, so clearly the public's overall feelings were still rather mixed. It is at this point that I need to emphasize the importance of mainstream success as a factor in these milestones. Sure, if you look hard enough, you can find positive depictions of the LGBT in media from throughout the 1900s, but those depictions were always very niche, and it didn't prove anything about society as a whole. It's only when the LGBT are depicted positively in a popular piece of media that we can know for certain that the attitude of the public at large has meaningfully changed. As such, as we move forward into the 2000s, the next major milestone became clear: to have LGBT supporting characters in popular pieces of media. And if I were to narrow down a decade that most clearly demonstrates the achievement of this milestone, it would have to be the 2010s. Across all types of media, prominent LGBT supporting casts began to manifest. In the realm of cartoons, we had things like 2013's Steven Universe, a show in which 90% of the cast is coded as lesbians, and they even had a gay marriage on screen. It's hard to overstate what an insane accomplishment this is when looked at through a historical lens. This sort of show could never have existed just 20 years prior, and yet now we have a hugely popular cartoon made for children prominently depicting same-sex relationships in a positive light. The realm of video games had their own version of this achievement, as there was this little indie RPG that you may have heard of which debuted in 2015 called Undertale. Aside from being one of the greatest and most popular games of all time, Undertale also had two prominent LGBT characters in its core cast who end up in a relationship by the end of the game. And that's on top of the dozen minor characters with non-binary subtext. By having prominent LGBT characters in such hugely popular mainstream media, it showed that this milestone had been achieved, and it opened the door to allow more conscious media corporations to begin integrating LGBT characters into their core casts. You would not have soulless megacorporations like Disney sneaking in LGBT nods if they didn't think that it would be both profitable and socially acceptable to do so. That is meaningful. With the achievements of stuff like Undertale and Steven Universe now complete, that meant there was only one more major milestone left to strive for. We had popular media with LGBT supporting characters, so now it was time to aim for the big one: LGBT protagonists. This is the current objective as of now, which brings us back to beloved Rapture. By having Johan be LGBT, Crawford and crew have thrown their hat into the ring as one of the contenders for achieving this milestone, which is a pretty big deal because, as of now, there really hasn't been any examples of a super popular video game with an explicitly LGBT protagonist. Sure, there have been stabs at it with stuff like The Last of Us Part 2, Life is Strange, and Celeste, but these examples either aren't universally loved, aren't popular on the same level as something like Undertale, or hide the LGBT nature of the protagonist for most, if not all, of the game. As it stands, while there are games with LGBT protagonists, none of them have quite had the acclaim, popularity, and transparency necessary to achieve the kind of cultural impact that this milestone entails. I think the LGBT community is aware of this on some some level, which is why I think they're so desperate to have an LGBT protagonist in something like Deltarune, which is a follow-up to Undertale. Thanks to its legacy, Deltarune is guaranteed mainstream success. So if Chris, the protagonist of that game, was actually confirmed to be non-binary, then it would be a huge win for the LGBT community. Unfortunately, I have major doubts that Toby Fox will ever outright confirm Chris's gender identity. Although I could be wrong, it would certainly be very Giga Chad of Toby Fox to herald not one, but two separate LGBT cultural milestones. However, as it stands, Deltarune has yet to officially achieve this, which means the door is still very much open for other game devs to cross the finish line first. And to be clear, it's not like there can only be one popular game with an LGBT protagonist. The weight of progress cannot be carried by any one person, so beloved Rapture definitely has a role to play. That said, and I really have to emphasize this, the only reason I say beloved Rapture has any chance of achieving mainstream success is because of the way they went about presenting their LGBT content in this game. You see, there are two ways that a writer can go about implementing this sort of thing. They can either play it subtly and introduce the LGBT theme slowly over the course of the game, or they can smash down the door waving a pride flag and shove it in your face from the very get-go. Thankfully, and much to my surprise, they went with the first option. Throughout the entirety of this demo, there's not a single outright mention of Johan's sexuality or of LGBT concepts in general. Sure, there's a ton of subtext you can read into, but that's not the sort of thing that your average player is going to notice. Lots of RPGs have characters with seemingly romantic subtext, which never actually manifests as anything other than friendship. So even with mentions of Johan caring deeply about his best friend, that sort of subtext only really means anything if you're actively looking for it. People who dislike or are neutral towards the LGBT won't think anything of it, whereas people who love this stuff will take notice of the fact that Johan only has a special interaction with one bed in the entire town, and it's the one that belongs to his best friend. I wonder what that could mean. Ahem. My point is, the fact that beloved Rapture is capable of showing such restraint when it comes to its LGBT content bodes extremely well for the game's chances at succeeding with a mainstream audience. To be perfectly clear, there's nothing wrong with being upfront and explicit with your LGBT characters, and there's certainly an audience who would prefer you wave that flag loud and proud. LGBT gamers, aka 90% of my audience, would absolutely adore you taking that sort of approach. However, the harsh reality is that games that wear their LGBT identity on their sleeve generally fail to find a mainstream audience. I know this is the case because there are dozens of games on Steam that you have never heard of which are wildly beloved by those who played them but never found wider success due to the perceived niche nature of LGBT content. The unfortunate truth is that you can't lure in a mainstream audience without at least somewhat obscuring LGBT material. You have to play it subtly until after you hook them so that when you finally debut your gay or trans characters, the viewer will be too invested to back out. Things like Undertale and Steven Universe never would have found the success they did if they hadn't initially obscured their LGBT elements. The gems in Steven Universe obscured their lesbianism behind their alien status, and none of the crystal gems are shown in an explicitly romantic relationship at the start of the series. Even Undertale hides its most explicit homosexual relationship until after the midway point of the game, with the pairing not being outright confirmed until nearly the end. Maybe in a few decades, you'll be able to display your LGBT elements without undermining your ability to find mainstream success, but that's just not feasible in the current cultural climate. If you want a recent example that proves this is how things are, then you need look no further than the film Bros, which came out just 1 month ago. If the poster didn't give it away, this film heavily emphasized and showed off its LGBT focus in all of its marketing, and as a result, when the film debuted, it flopped at the box office, and the creator explicitly stated that it failed because straight people didn't go watch it. Now, it's easy to blame this sort of failure purely on homophobia, but I don't think it's entirely that simple. Homophobia was likely a factor, but some people didn't go see the film purely because it didn't seem like it was meant for them. If you're not LGBT, media explicitly designed to be LGBT-oriented can seem a little too niche to be something you'll enjoy. Take me, for example. I'm pretty freaking positive towards the LGBT community. I wouldn't have made a video like this unless I really cared about y'all. But when it comes to how I spend my free time, I'm likely going to choose to watch something that's beloved by a lot of people and not just beloved by a niche group of people. It's not because of homophobia, it's just common sense. If lots of people love something, then that means there's a good chance you'll like it as well. I adore Undertale and Steven Universe, but I only chose to experience them because they were so popular. I knew it would be worth my time. The positive LGBT content was a pleasant surprise, but it wasn't the reason I dove in. Similarly, I don't go to the movie theater super often, so if I'm going to go, it has to be for something that everyone's raving about. If Bros had been a huge success, I would have been much more likely to go see it. My point being, some people, even those who want the LGBT to succeed, won't go out of their way to support something purely out of principle. They need more than that. If you want to get the public to watch your movie or play your game, you have to lure them in with a good experience that is enjoyable independent of its LGBT themes, because evidence shows that the general public won't support it otherwise. To be clear, it's not fair that the LGBT community has to operate under these constraints and jump through so many additional hoops just to have the same level of success as heterosexual writers. But sadly, this is how things are for now. So you need to factor in the public's disposition if you want to reach a broader audience. With all that context, you can start to see why beloved Rapture is so exciting, yet also so anxiety-inducing. It seems to be doing everything correctly, which means it has the chance to really blow up and achieve something meaningful. The core gameplay, music, and visuals are great. The LGBT themes are being handled with delicacy and care, and it's coming out at a key time in history. There's no reason that a game like this couldn't achieve something comparable to Undertale. Now, you might think I'm overblowing it to compare it to Undertale, and you might be right, but think about it. They're both sprite-based indie RPGs, they've both been funded through a Kickstarter, they're both tackling heavy themes and topics, and they both include prominent LGBT elements. The only thing that really differentiates them, and the only thing that could potentially trip up beloved Rapture, is its adult content. It all boils down to whether the writers for this game can present these adult topics in a mature, nuanced, and respectful manner. If it can land on the correct side of mature versus adult, then the sky really does feel like the limit. So, to any writers out there who want to make a show, movie, book, or game, there are 3 main sentiments that I want you to take away from this video. Number 1, if you're going to include adult topics and concepts, make sure to give them the nuance and respect they deserve. There is a very fine line between mature and edgy, and you don't want to end up on the side of edgy. Number 2, if you want to have LGBT elements, characters, or themes in your story, keep in mind that how you present these themes will impact your mainstream appeal. Showing restraint will give you a better chance of gaining a wider audience, but being more upfront is also a valid path. Just be aware that it will impact the popularity of your story. And number 3, make sure to add Beloved Rapture to your wishlist on Steam. Even if you have no intention of buying the game, adding it to your wishlist will actually boost the game in the Steam algorithm when it gets its full release. This is an easy and free way to help the game find success. That said, if you'd like to financially support this game, they do have a Patreon. Although, it is my ethical responsibility as a content creator to warn you that there is always a degree of risk anytime you donate to an indie game that has yet to be released. I've seen countless indie games accept tons of donations only to get trapped in development hell and never get released. Now, I'm not saying Beloved Rapture will do that. I've had nothing but good experiences with its developers, but it's important to keep in mind all possibilities when choosing how to spend your money. That's the end of the video. Thank you all for watching. This was a pretty different type of video than I usually make, but I had a lot of fun putting it together. I hope I didn't step on any toes, and I really hope I didn't come across as unsympathetic to the LGBT community. I really do care about you guys, and I really do want to see you succeed. So if anything in this video came across as hurtful, please know that wasn't my intent. I was giving some brutally honest advice, yes, but sometimes you have to dial back the positivity in order to give pragmatic advice. Or at least that was my intention. Maybe I failed and I just came across as rude. If so, please let me know. I'm more than happy to hear your advice, and I really want to hear what the LGBT community has to say. My sincere thanks go out to all my patrons whose financial support during these difficult times allows me to continue making videos like these. Special shoutouts to E-Roll, Hannah Brown, Lil Nyrus X, Mold Brain, and Suit Number 1. And especial shoutouts go to Captain APEC, who is continuing to be an utter madman and is patronizing me at the Spampton tier. You are just out of this world. Your kindness is immensely meaningful. Thank you so much, and thank all of you for continuing to support me. It really does make a difference. And with that, I'll go ahead and wrap this video up. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you've got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.